experienced what most people would call an absolute nightmare. I attended my first improv theater class. And how many people here have seen an improv performance or watched, like, Whose Line Is It Anyway? And a few hands in here. For those of you who are not familiar, what we do with improv is we actually go on stage in front of a live audience with a group of people, and we make things up. We take a word of suggestion from the audience, and everything else is just completely made up with that inspiration. And it sounds pretty scary, but I got really into it really fast. If you had told me 15 years ago that this would be a huge part of my life, I would have said you were insane. But here we are. And what really got me into it is it started with just how fun it was, and then I really fell in love with the community. And then once I was reflecting after several months of doing it, I realized how much of a transformative impact it was having on how I showed up at work and in my life. And I realized that I was much more confident, much more creative, much more collaborative, and that's what sparked the idea of doing what I do now. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, I admit I am not an engineer myself, despite other than a few Treehouse courses on web development here and there. But a lot of my clients are engineering leaders. I'm an executive coach and facilitator for tech leaders, and I apply principles from improv theater to leadership development, which is pretty fun. Prior to doing this full-time, I spent 15 years in various ad tech and marketing companies, leading various teams. The last ones were Yahoo and Verizon before I started working for myself full-time. And I was there for about 7 years, and it underwent many iterations throughout that time, lots of acquisitions and mergers and rebrands, as everybody in the tech industry is very familiar with. But that was my last part before I started going out on my own. And then I just always put my education up here too, in case there's any fellow alums in the room. But I did my undergrad at USC, and I have a master's in leadership from Michigan State. So let's talk about innovation in general for a moment. So obviously innovation is critical for any company to stay ahead, and especially in this AI renaissance that we're in currently in 2024. But how do you actually sustain innovation across a company and team? It really takes embedding it into the culture. So how I define what a culture of innovation is a culture that fosters creative thinking, employee collaboration, and psychological safety in order to drive business growth and also employee happiness, because it generates a lot of that as well. And the thing is, there's also a lot of evidence supporting the outcomes that come with having a culture of innovation. McKinsey did a study where they identified 50 plus companies that they called innovative growers. These were basically growing companies that had various characteristics of an innovative culture. And they found that compared to other peers in their industry, there was substantial growth in revenue and shareholder value. And it also shows up with engineering teams as well. In the Google DORA report, State of DevOps report for last year, they found that teams with a generative culture, which is many of the same characteristics of how I define a culture of innovation, had 30% higher organizational performance compared to companies that did not. So there's a lot of clear evidence that there are performance outcomes that come with prioritizing innovation within your culture and really deeply embedding it in that. Now, there's a couple of things to note about innovation. For one thing, it requires both divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And what I mean by this is divergent thinking is generative. So this is the process where we're looking at a lot of different possibilities. We're coming up with all these creative ideas and solutions to problems, and just basically generating as many ideas as possible. And that's where you get into a lot of these out-of-the-box solutions that don't necessarily come to mind immediately. And then the convergent thinking part is actually taking those, narrowing them down, and then coming up using analysis and logic and so forth to figure out the best solution, the best answer, whatever that is. So one is generative, the other is evaluative. And this works really great if you do it this way. So if you have a separate process for the generative part, for the divergent thinking, because that really has to be done separately from the convergent thinking to be done effectively, and then you narrow down and do the analysis part, it works incredibly well. But what happens in a lot of companies, and I think corporate structure in general, is far more focused on the convergent thinking part of this than the divergent part. So what usually ends up happening is it looks more like this. You generate a smaller number of ideas and solutions. It's really just the first things that come to mind, and it's not necessarily the more out-of-the-box solutions that actually drive innovation. And then you just go straight to the analysis part of things. And this is where you get these blind spots where there's ideas and solutions and opportunities that are being missed because we're skipping that process. The other thing that comes into play here is what I call the inner judge. And this is this voice that all of us have inside of our head. It likes to maybe demean you or call out your weaknesses, whether they're real or imaginary. And it can be quite active in your head, and it tends to get in the way of innovation. And the inner judge has many forms. It can come in many forms. It can come as a perfectionist or a guilt tripper. But the theme across all of these is that the inner judge is not actually inherently bad. It evolved as a survival mechanism from the days where risks could be very bad for your lifespan. So it wants to keep you from doing things like eating potentially poisonous berries and doing things that will alienate you from your community, which then in a time of being on your own could lead to death, basically. So that's where it's coming from. It's really trying to keep you from taking these risks. But it's the enemy of creativity and idea generation, because this part of our head will go ahead and censor those ideas before we even really get started. Fortunately, improv is really good at addressing this. There's actually this study that was done by Dr. Charles Lim in 2008 using fMRI images, and he wanted to see what was the impact of someone improvising, like what actually happened to their brain, and found that there were two parts of the brain that were affected. There was the blue area, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the yellow part, which is the medial prefrontal cortex. And what he found is that the blue part went way down when somebody was improvising, which is the inhibition and control associated with it. So it's literally like your inner censor, your inner judge, was turned down when somebody was actually improvising. And the inverse of that, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is associated with creativity, expression, and language, activated up significantly. So like literally the process of improv helps to quiet that inner judge and allow you to get more in touch with creativity and ideas that you wouldn't necessarily access otherwise, which I think is pretty cool. So what does this ultimately mean? Like, how do you implement a culture of innovation? Well, I'm gonna go through 5 tactics that you can use to build this, all using principles from improv. And then at the end of this, I'm actually also going to provide you with a way to get actual improv exercises that support these as well. So the first one is around awareness and listening. And when I say awareness, it tends to align very well between improv and mindfulness. Now, one caveat of mindfulness, when I say this, there's automatically a lot of people who are like, well, I don't like to meditate. Meditation is not for me. I'm really bad at meditation. So for one thing, you're not bad at meditation because nobody is. The whole idea is that our brains are going to constantly be thinking new thoughts. You're going to get distracted. And the whole idea of meditation is just bringing your thoughts back, recognizing when that happens and bringing it back. So you're not bad at meditation, you're just human. But also, mindfulness does not equal meditation. It's just an umbrella that meditation is a part of. So you do not have to meditate to grow the skill. But what you can do is everything from mindful eating to taking walks in nature with no devices and really focusing on your environment. It's really just about grounding you in the present moment. And what this does is it makes you more aware of your own thoughts, so, which is really useful for kind of differentiating between the inner judge and your actual like creative ideas and thoughts. And it also makes you more aware of what's happening with the other people around you, with the people on your team, and increasing empathy and awareness, and ultimately trust and psychological safety. So an example of one of my favorite, very simple mindful exercises before like a meeting or something is just what I call a 5 senses observation. It has many different names. But literally just calling out 5 things that you can see in the environment around you, 4 things that you can physically touch, which might include your legs touching the chair beneath you, for example, or just like an object you can hold in your hands. And then 3 things that you can hear in the environment, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And just by doing that, it takes a very small amount of time, but it just helps center you and ground you in your environment. The other big piece of this one is listening. And listening is something that we are not very good at naturally. We're not really trained on how to do it. And there's really like 3 levels of listening, not counting just not listening at all, which is also happens. But the first one is selective listening, which is listening to respond. And this is the level most of us are at, unless we're actively doing something to focus more on the listening piece. But this is your listening, but you're going, okay, how does what this person's saying affect me? And what am I going to say in response to this? So instead of actually listening to what's happening, you're figuring out like what you're gonna say next and what your response is gonna be. So you're not really actually in the present moment. The next one is what most people think of as active listening, which is focused listening and really listening to hear. So in this level, you are listening to words and you are like recognizing that somebody is speaking, and maybe you're leaning in or nodding and showing signs of listening, but you're still filtering everything through your own perspective and what's ultimately important to you. So it's not quite the full level of listening. And the last one is immersive listening, which is listening to understand. And there's a big difference between this and the first level. With immersive listening, you're not just listening to words, you're actually paying attention to body language, to context, to tone of voice, like everything around that. You're reading between the lines and using intuition to kind of figure out what this person is not saying. And you're really trying to understand it from their perspective and their point of view, and instead of filtering it through your own point of view. And this level of listening can be so powerful. It can unlock insights that you would never have gotten otherwise. That will often help you with things like retention. But also it really creates a level of trust and psychological safety, because it feels really good to have somebody actually listen to you and not just be half listening while they're typing an email on their phone and thinking about how they're going to respond to you. The next piece of this is leading with authenticity. And there's a couple points within this that I want to say. The first one is calling out the elephant in the room. Because what happens, I always tell the story from when I first started doing improv. It was maybe my 3rd or 4th performance. And I was coming on stage, and with improv, we always have chairs on stage. It's the only thing that we have on stage. But they were lined up, and I was trying to just lay down on the chairs, and like they were a couch. There's what I was pretending they were. But I'm not the most graceful person, and instead, I'm not sure what happened, but the chairs separated, and I just ended up falling off of them entirely. And my first reaction at that point in my improv journey was just to be mortified and to try to cover it up and try to hide it and just like move on, pretend it had never happened, instead of actually just acknowledging it and like integrating it into the scene from there. And what happens when you do that, when you try to, this big thing happens that everybody knows has happened and you're not acknowledging it, it creates this tension in the audience. And the same thing happens in the workplace as well. When there's something big has happened, like layoffs or reorg or anything else, if there's something big that is happening and you're not acknowledging with your team and with your larger company, you feel the tension in the room. Or the Zoom room, as it may be. there's this tension that comes from not acknowledging what is there, what is very present, what is happening. So, for one thing, that being as transparent as possible, and especially for these big things, calling them out. And then the other piece is it's okay to be human and to let your team know that you are a human being. And this doesn't mean sharing all these personal details with your employees. I'm not recommending that. But vulnerability can be really powerful, and especially when it comes to talking about things that have been difficult for you that you've overcome, it creates these really genuine connections that are hard to get to otherwise. Next, fostering collaboration and belonging. So how many people here are familiar with the improv concept of yes and? Got like a few hands. So yes and is basically the cornerstone of improv. So what it means is when somebody puts something out there, an idea or statement or whatever, responding with yes, which means you're affirming that idea, you're not trying to negate its existence, and then adding your own contribution to it. So if it's like, I think we should do this feature, it's like, yes, we should, and we can also add this component to it. This is very different from what we often do especially when we're in convergent thinking mode, where it's something like yes, but, or just an outright no. And it feels very different. It feels very different when you're on the receiving end of it. So this can be an interesting exercise to do, particularly with brainstorming. You're obviously not going to respond this way in every moment in the workplace. But when you're coming up with an idea generation, especially, it can be really powerful. And it's also just interesting to pay attention to how often you're responding with a yes, but, or no as you go throughout your day. And sometimes just a subtle change there can be very impactful. And then the other piece of that is really, we have a saying in improv where we talk about always make your scene partner look good. And I think that applies really well to driving collaboration and belonging as well. So when in doubt, make your teammate look good. And that starts with recognizing their contributions and recognizing it in a way that is meaningful to them, but really carrying that out. When you're in doubt, always make your teammate look good. And then failure is another critical thing to talk about when we're talking about innovation, because it goes very well with innovation. And like with many things, Brené Brown says this really well, but there is no innovation and creativity without failure, period. And what happens here is if there's a culture where failure is considered not acceptable or where people are afraid to fail, it is the antithesis of innovation, because what happens is that's not an environment where that is very conducive to coming up with creative ideas and solutions, first of all, but secondly, when somebody does have them, they're a lot less likely to speak up and bring that forth, because the risks are just too high if there's potential consequences, negative consequences for failing with good intentions. So I always talk about normalizing failure, creating safe spaces for failure, and also creating rituals built into a culture that acknowledge failure and talk about its learnings. So some people do this in periodic team meetings where they'll talk about like the last quarter, like what the biggest mistakes were and like what their learnings were from that. Whatever you do as a leader, it has to come from you first. You have to model it first, because if you're not taking ownership and accountability for your own mistakes, your team is certainly not going to want to. So whatever you do, start from the top. And I also know this does not mean tolerating failure, does not mean tolerating incompetence or underperformance. So if somebody's not performing up to the standards they should be, that is a completely separate thing. But making space for productive failure is very impactful when it comes to allowing space for innovation. And then lastly, I would be remiss if I talked about improv without mentioning play. So the way that this comes up in work, play is not something that's really a part of the adult experience, not in the workplace. And yes, you can. My recommendation is just integrate some improv games into your meetings if you're open to that. I will give you some of those that you can do that with. But it also just starts with things like changing the environment and eliminating repetitive tasks as much as possible to make space for play, for experimentation, for exploring things just for the sake of exploring things without there having to be this like heavy outcome tied to it. And feeling like you're in a space where it's safe to do so without it having consequences for your work. So as we start to bring things to a close, this brings us to 5 takeaways. So these are: cultivate awareness and listening, embrace transparency and vulnerability, always make your teammate look good when in doubt, always go back to that, normalize failure, and encourage play and experimentation. And I invite you to pick just one thing from these and try something out in the next 2 weeks with your team, and just keep an open mind and see what happens, and you might be surprised by the results. Lastly, when it comes to actually putting this into practice, so if you scan the QR code, this is also on the postcards that are around the room, and if you didn't get one, I can always give you one afterwards. So if you can't scan this, don't worry about it, there's another way to do it. But I have here, if you go to this page and register, I will automatically send you a directory of 8 of my favorite exercises to do with teams. And these are quick, like 5-10 minute, maybe 15 minutes if you add a lot of like debrief, but they're really intended to be something you can just do at the beginning of a meeting just to re-energize people and mix it up and kind of get people in a more creative space. And I also am doing a whole conference pack for this, so you'll get that right away, but I will also follow up with a copy of the slides, a couple of other PDF resources, like including some exercises you can do on your own to help build these skills. And also I'm doing a giveaway for a $2,500 worth of leadership coaching as part of this as well. So if you're interested, you can get to it that way. I will also be doing a roundtable at 1 p.m., so just after everybody has a chance to grab some lunch in the roundtables area of the expo hall. And that'll be an opportunity to do maybe an exercise or two as a group to actually try some of this out, and also just having more room for open discussion and Q&A so that we can continue the conversation. And otherwise, I have my contact information there as well. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me. I would love to continue the conversation. So with that, I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite quotes, and this is from the Improv goddess, that is Tina Fey. But in improv, there are no mistakes, only beautiful, happy accidents. So I wish all of you a career full of beautiful, happy accidents. So, thank you.